In the previous video, we took a look at the SPI bus between the playfield and the backbox. That bus allows the microcontroller on the playfield to communicate with the controller in the backbox. The data on the bus carries the score digits and the state of several of the LEDs on the playfield. I was able to tap into the bus by connecting an Arduino to some of the pins along this header. I got a pretty good start on decoding the data on the SPI bus and figured out how the score digits work and some of the bits that control the LEDs. But there's only so much I can do as a listener. What I really needed to do to make sure I understand how the protocol between the playfield and the backbox works is to control it. My plan is to do that by replacing the Arduino with a microcontroller called a Teensy. It runs some of the same API as an Arduino does, but the key difference for me between my Arduino Uno and this new Teensy is that this one runs on 3.3 volts. The Arduino GPIO pins, the digital pins, put out 5 volts. This microcontroller on the playfield runs on 3.3 volts. And the controller in the backbox, I can only assume, is expecting 3.3 volts because that's what the controller on the playfield is putting out. So I couldn't control the controller in the backbox with my Arduino because it's putting out 5 volts, and I might blow out the chip in the backbox. So I had to find a microcontroller that runs at the same voltage as this one does, and that uses GPIO at the same voltage as this one does. And also one that is able to produce audio, because this controller on the playfield drives the speaker in the cabinet directly. This Teensy fit the bill pretty well. It runs at 3.3 volts. It's really powerful, far more powerful than the Arduino is. And it has audio capabilities if you use the Teensy audio add-on board. So my goal for this video is to take the playfield completely out of the picture and run the backbox off the GPIO pins of the Teensy. So I disconnect this ribbon cable and hook it directly up to the pins on this microcontroller and see if I can get the backbox score digits to light up just like they are when they're controlled by this microcontroller on the playfield. So remember, the SPI bus between the playfield and the backbox is a 3-wire protocol on this machine. We've got the chip select, the clock, and the data transfer line, master out, slave in. Let's take a look at how each of those 3 signals works together to transfer data. Each of the 3 signals, the chip select, master out, slave in, and clock, are digital. So they're either low or high. And in the case of master and slave out, it carries binary data as either a low being a 0 or high being a binary 1. The master uses the chip select pin to signal to a slave when it should start listening. If there are multiple slaves on a single master, there can be multiple chip selects, and only one of the slaves gets activated at a time by the master. The chip select pin starts out high, and when the master wants to activate a slave, it drops the value from high to low. And the slave will continue listening throughout the duration of whenever that chip select pin is set to low. So the master keeps the chip select pin low throughout the duration of the transfer. So it starts high, goes low, and then it remains low until the master wants the slave to stop listening, at which point it sets it high again. So the chip select pin activates the slave. The clock pin tells the slave when to sample input. In most implementations, it starts low, and when it transitions up on the rising edge, it tells the slave to take a sample from the MOSI pin. So right now we're showing the MOSI pin as being low. When the clock pin went from low to high, this slave would take a look at the MOSI pin and interpret the bit that's on it. So if it had stayed low, like that, the slave would have interpreted it as being a binary 0. The clock pin stays high for just a little bit and then falls back down again to low. Now if the master wanted to indicate a binary 1, while the clock pin is low, it would raise the MOSI pin. And then trigger the master to read the pin by raising the clock pin high again. So when the slave saw that rising edge of the clock right here, it would sample the MOSI pin and interpret this high value as a binary 1. So if you took a look at the signals on the bus, you'd see a pattern like this, where the clock would repeatedly rise and fall in a pretty regular pattern. And then, while that's happening, the MOSI pin would change to indicate changes between binary 1 and binary 0. So in this case, this rising edge here would be interpreted as a 0. This rising edge would be interpreted as a 1. Another 1 here. A 0 here. 1 here. 0 here. And so on. And it would continue that way throughout the duration of while the chip select is set to low. When the chip select goes back high again, the slave stops listening, and the master can either not transmit anything or choose a different slave to transmit to. The Arduino libraries take care of a lot of this for you. I wrote this program for my Teensy that acts as a master on the SPI bus and sends the bits that should tell the backbox to show all zeros. So if you translate these strings of binary digits to hexadecimal, they correspond to these digits here. So I've got 6 different strings of hex that correspond to the 6 strings that I saw when I snooped on the SPI bus. Each one of them controlling a different score digit, setting all of them to 0. So I've got 6 sets of 8 bytes each that I'm trying to send over the SPI bus. Setting up the bus and transferring over it is pretty simple. I designate one of my pins as chip select and set it to output. I start the pin high, so the slave is not activated yet, and then I take control of the SPI bus. There are a couple default pins on the microcontroller that are designated as the SPI clock and the SPI MOSI and MISO. So those default pins are used if I don't specify any other pins to use. After I initialize the SPI bus, I can take control of it and set certain settings on it. So here I'm saying that I want to communicate over the SPI bus at no more than 2 megahertz. I want to communicate the bytes that I'm transferring most significant bit first, and I want to communicate in SPI mode 0. That corresponds to what we saw here, especially that we're sampling data on the rising edge of the clock. After we set our settings, then we can activate the slave by setting our chip select pin low, and then we call SPI transfer to send bytes across the bus. This is sending a single byte, and it's inside of one for loop to send all 8 bytes in a line, and inside of another for loop to send all 6 lines. So I set chip select, I initialize the SPI bus, set my settings, set chip select low to activate the slave, send all of my bytes across the bus, set chip select high to deactivate the slave, and then I release control of the SPI bus. So hopefully what that does is it causes the backbox to display all zeros, a 0 for each of the 6 score digits. Unfortunately, that's not what it did. In fact, it didn't do anything when I hooked it up to the backbox. I messed with this for a long time, and I just couldn't get it to work. Mostly what I messed with was the clock rate and the SPI mode. I also changed around where I activated the slave, where I began the transmission and told the slave I was ending the transmission. Right now I'm sending all 6 of the streams of bytes in a single transmission, because I'm activating the slave, sending all 6 lines, and then deactivating the slave. So I changed that around and I put the slave activation inside of the loop. So in this case I would activate the slave, and I would send only a single message and then deactivate the slave. So I'd send this one and then deactivate the slave, and send that one and deactivate it, and so forth. That didn't work either. And I tried putting it in here. So I only sent the slave 1 byte at a time. So I'd activate it and send this, and then deactivate it, and activate it and send this, and deactivate it, and so on. That didn't work either. I went through a lot of permutations, and I couldn't get it to work. I even ditched the SPI library, and I tried to do this kind of bit manipulation just using digital write commands. So I did the clock myself, and I did the chip select myself, and I did the MOSI stuff myself. Because Teensy 4.0, the chip I'm using is relatively new, and I'm not sure if the SPI libraries are really up to snuff yet. But nothing I did worked. I just couldn't get that backbox to light up. So I had to resort to something else. After I exhausted all the combinations I can think of, I finally broke down and bought a logic analyzer. I really wish I had done this earlier. This thing was like $12 on Amazon, and if I had had it during the previous video, my work would have been a lot easier. This one is a USB device that plugs into your PC on one side and then has several pins on the other side. The PC samples each of these pins thousands of times a second and shows you a picture very similar to what I just drew up before with the logic levels for the SPI bus. So, similar to how I read the SPI bus with my Arduino before, I can attach these pins to the header up here and get an image of what the chip select and MOSI and clock pins are doing, and take a look at what the data format looks like and see if my assumptions were right on how I should send it. I mean, apparently they're not right, because when I try to send it myself, it's not working. So let's take a look and see what it looks like using the logic analyzer. So I've got the logic analyzer hooked up to the SPI bus on the header of the playfield. There's the 3 wires going to the logic analyzer, and then a ground going to the battery ground where the playfield is plugged in, and then the usual connections to battery positive, battery negative, and shorten the power switch to ground to turn the playfield on. The other end of the logic analyzer is hooked up to my PC via USB. Let's take a look at the software for the logic analyzer. This is an open source program called PulseView. My logic analyzer has 8 channels. You can see each one of them here on the left. I'm only analyzing a 3-wire protocol, so I'll only need 3 of them. Let's go ahead and get those labeled. So the first one is on channel 0, chip select, and we've been coloring that purple. Next one on channel 1 is MOSI, coloring that blue. Channel 2, we've got the clock, which we'll make orange. Now the rest of the channels I don't have connected to anything, so let's just get rid of them. Click on the little probe here. I want to disable everything that's not named. Now I've got my 3 channels. The way this works is it will take a sample of each of my 3 pins every so often, and that interval between sampling is controlled here. I've been using 2 megahertz. My SPI timing has been about 2 megahertz, so let's go ahead and use that. And then it takes that many samples, or it takes the samples that often, and then it takes this many of the samples. So if I do 1 million samples, and I'm doing 2 million samples per second, I've only got half a second here. So let's ramp that up a bit. So I'll get 5 seconds of samples. And then all I have to do is run it. So I will, off camera, I'm going to start the board up, and then I'm going to click the run button. it's running, and I'm collecting data. So it'll do that for about 5 seconds and then stop. Now I can zoom in and I can see what the data transfer actually looks like. So you can see my chip select starts out high and then it goes low for the duration of the transfer. During that transfer, my clock is pulsing with every time that the master wants the slave to sample a bit. And here, rising edge, this would have been a 1, this would have been a 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and so on. So we can actually count the number of bits here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's 2 bytes during every transfer. What's really cool about the software is I don't have to do all that kind of manual figuring. I can just tell it, hey, analyze this as SPI. And then it gives me this SPI channel, and I can associate my signals with that SPI channel. So my clock is this one. I'd already figured out my MOSI, and my chip select is this one. And check that out. There's my data. So it tells me what each bit would have been interpreted as, and it gives me the byte in hex for each one of those, and then corresponding with the chip select, it gives me the contents of the entire transfer. 90C0817E 80018209. So already I can see where some of my assumptions weren't right. Let's compare this to the bits over here. So this was there's the whole transfer. The very first byte of the transfer, 10010000. I was thinking the first byte was this, but actually the first byte that's transferred is this. So I was a byte off. It should start here, and then 1 1 all zeros, 1 1 all zeros, and then go here. And also in my program, I was not setting the chip select right. So eventually I did try activating the slave, sending a byte, and then deactivating the slave, so 1 byte at a time. But I never tried sending 2 bytes at a time. So I'll have to change these loops to send 2 bytes in between the chip select toggling. But anyway, you can see how this logic analyzer makes things so much easier. I remember I was dumping binary data and just trying to guess like where a command started and where it ended. And this just does it for me. It's really cool. You can see the duration of the command cycle and the amount of time in between it. Let's turn these cursors on. So it's 300 microseconds, start to finish. And then how much time in between? $676. Let's check out these clock pulses, if I can get in there. I wonder how often the clock pulses, what the frequency is. Mm, 14 kilohertz. Anyway, for $12, this thing is great. This is the kind of stuff, like I don't do any analog work. It's all digital. I've always kind of wanted an oscilloscope on my desk to look at stuff like this, but those are, you know, $500, $600 for a decent one. If all you're doing is digital stuff, then $12 and you're set. And it can do tons of different protocols. Not just SPI like what I'm using it for. Really cool stuff. In fact, I don't know if I would have been able to do this without having this logic analyzer. After I started looking at the format that this was being sent in, I kind of refactored my Arduino program to send these bytes 2 at a time and in the right order. And I totally expected it to work. But I fired it up and I got nothing on the score displays. So then I started digging in to the timing of these signals, like how long the chip select was high for between sending pairs of bytes compared to what I was doing with my timing down here. So this is what I captured from the playfield, and this is what I was sending using the Teensy SPI. So I was really scrutinizing the timing, and I was trying to get these clock cycles just right. So just the right frequency of clock, and then I was trying to measure, you know, how long up here, how long was a signal high before the rising edge of the clock. You know, like getting down to like 1 microsecond timing, trying to figure out why, even though I was sending the same thing using my program, it wasn't being registered the same way that it was when the playfield was sending it. So I was using Teensy's SPI implementation, and it seemed to go a lot faster than what the playfield was sending, and I could tell by looking at the timings. So I tried to cut the maximum speed of the SPI down. I cut it about like half, and it still wasn't slow enough to match the timing. And I tried to cut it even more, and it just wouldn't go any lower. I think the SPI, I think Arduino SPI maybe has a minimum speed that it can run at, based on the clock of the chip. So I couldn't clock it down any farther, and I was like, well, maybe I'll ditch the SPI and I'll just use shift out. So you can shift bits kind of the same way SPI does, but using a function called shift out. And people don't like it because it's slower, but in this case I needed it to be slower. So I rewrote my program to use shift out, and I looked at that timing, and it was still too fast. So I looked at the Arduino source code for shift out, and it just shifts as fast as it can. There's no delays, and especially on this Teensy, it's a super fast chip, so much faster than a regular Arduino. It was just blazing fast when I was using the relatively slow shift out function. So to get the timing just right, I actually wrote my own shift out function over here, and I inserted delays down to microsecond precision to mimic the timing of the playfields protocol just as good as I could. And I got the timing to match really well. I don't have a picture of it, but I got it to match really well. It's almost indistinguishable from the playfields transfers up here. So I fired that up, and I was really excited, and nothing. It just didn't work. So I went back and I was looking at timing again, and I couldn't see any differences. So eventually I thought, well, I kind of had been thinking this entire time that chip in the back box, how does it know what to do? It's got all these pins. How does it know which LEDs to change and how to control the score digits? How is it programmed from the factory? Like I was trying to read through the data sheet of that chip to see if I could get any insight into how it's programmed, to see maybe what the maximum SPI speed was or whatever. But there was nothing there, nothing documented there. So I was thinking, well, maybe it gets programmed, just for the company who buys it. They buy a couple thousand of them, and they the factory programs them a certain way. And I kind of just left it at that. But as I was thinking through, like, what could I be missing? I started thinking about sometimes when I would run my old program that dumped the bits using my Arduino, I'd see some junk at the beginning, and I was like, I wonder if the microcontroller in the playfield is initializing that chip in the back box with some transfers at the beginning when it first starts up. And I was just thinking it was junk, but maybe it wasn't just junk. So I tried starting my analyzer and setting the duration to be pretty long, and then firing up the playfield with the analyzer already running. And that's what I've actually got up here at the top. And I managed to catch a whole sequence of bytes that I didn't know was there. So this pattern here, it doesn't match any of the other patterns that we saw for the score digits over here. This is something totally new that I hadn't managed to see before. So I thought this is kind of my last shot. I'll just replicate this and send it first before I do anything else and see what happens. So I've got this initialization string, and then I've got my zeros that I was sending before. just kind of rearranged so the 90 is first and the 09 is last. Still using my own shift functions, not the built-in Arduino SPI, so I can mimic that timing precisely. And then at the beginning of the sketch in the setup function, before I try to send any other data to the backbox chip, I just send that initialization string, and I give it some time to start up first. I'm not sure if that's required or not, but I didn't want if the backbox chip takes longer to start than the Teensy does, I wanted to make sure the backbox chip caught it. So I wait a half second, then I send that string, then I wait the same amount of time that it waits up here before sending the first score digits. And then I just do the same stuff I was doing before. I just loop sending the score digits that I want to display, this all zeros. And it works. Check this out. I've got my Teensy powered by my power supply. What used to be the SPI lines are now my own personal shift functions, but they're shifting to the ribbon cable to the backbox and displaying all zeros. And those aren't all zeros from the playfield. Those are all zeros from my microcontroller. And what's even cooler, let me show you. I'm going to pull power from the backbox and then from the Teensy. I'm going to reprogram it. You have to remember to pull power before you hook up USB to it. Let me just upload a new version. And then resume power to the backbox and resume power to the micro. Hey. So my theory about being able to control each individual segment of the 7 segment displays is correct. I can actually display text and patterns along with score digits. I'm pretty happy with that.